So this is part 16 of my reflection and commentary on the Platonic dialogues, the Statesman. And this will likely be the last part. We have about 2 pages left, just a little over 2 pages. So let's make the best out of this last episode. And hopefully it doesn't run too long. So the first thing that I would like to do is to read the remainder of this dialogue, and then to go back over and have a reflective experience over it. So beginning on the previous page for just a little bit more context, the visitor says, "Well then, is a courageous soul that grasps this sort of truth not tamed, and wouldn't it be especially willing, as a result, to share in what is just? Whereas if it fails to get a share of it, doesn't it rather slide away towards becoming like some kind of beast?" Young Socrates says, "Quite." The visitor continues, "And what of the case of the moderate sort of nature? If it gets a share of these opinions, doesn't it become genuinely moderate and wise, so far as wisdom goes in the context of life in a city? While if it fails to get a portion of the things we're talking about, doesn't it very appropriately acquire a disgraceful reputation for simple-mindedness?" Absolutely. And let's not say, shall we, that this sort of interweaving and bonding, in the case of vicious men in relation to each other, and good men in relation to the vicious, ever turns out to be lasting, nor that any sort of expert knowledge would ever seriously use it in relation to people like this. No. How would it? What I propose we should say is that it only takes root through laws in the dispositions that were both born noble in the first place and have been nurtured in accordance with their nature, and that it is for these that this remedy exists by virtue of expertise. And we said this bonding together is more divine, uniting parts of virtue that are by nature unlike each other and tend in opposite directions. Very true. Yes, and the remaining bonds, which are human, once this divine one exists, are perhaps not difficult at all to understand, or to effect, once one has understood them. How then, and what are they, says young Socrates? Those that consist in intermarriages and the sharing of children, and in those matters relating to private giving away in marriage. For most people, in the way they handle these things, do not bind themselves together correctly with respect to the protection, or the procreation of children. Why so? Is there any reason why anyone should seriously concern themselves with censoring the pursuit of wealth and forms of influence in such contexts, as if it were worth discussing? None. No, it would be more appropriate for us to discuss those people who pay attention to family types and ask whether they are acting erroneously in some way. Yes, that's reasonable. Well, they act out of entirely the wrong sort of consideration. They go for what is immediately easiest, welcoming those who are much like them, and not liking those who are unlike them, assigning the largest part of their decisions to their feelings of antipathy. How? The moderate, I think, look out for people with the disposition they themselves possess, and so far as they can, they both marry from among these and marry off their daughters. They are giving away back to people of this sort. The type related to courage does just the same thing, seeking after the nature that belongs to itself, and when both types ought to do completely the opposite of this. How and why, says young Socrates? Because it is in the nature of courage that when it is reproduced over many generations without being mixed with a moderate nature, it comes to peak of power at first, but in the end it bursts out completely in fits of madness. That's likely. And in its turn, the soul that is too full of reserve and has no admixture of courageous initiative, and is reproduced over many generations in this way, by nature grows more sluggish than is timely, and then, in the end, is completely crippled. It's likely that this too turns out, as you say. The visitor says, "It was these bonds that I meant when I said that there was no difficulty at all in tying them together once the situation existed in which both types had a single option about what was fine and good. For this is the single and complete task of kingly weaving together, never to allow moderate dispositions to stand away from the courageous. Rather, by working them closely into each other, as if with a shuttle, through sharing of opinions, through honors, dishonors, esteem, and giving of pledges to one another, it draws together a smooth and fine woven fabric out of them, as the expression is, and always entrusts offices and cities to these in common. How? By choosing the person who has both qualities to put in charge, wherever there turns out to be a need for a single officer, and by mixing together a part of each of these groups, where there is a need for more than one. For the dispositions of moderate people, when in office, are markedly cautious, just and conservative, but they lack bite, and a certain sharp and practical keenness. This too certainly seems to be the case. And the dispositions of the courageous, in their turn, are inferior to the others in relation to justice and caution, but have an exceptionable degree of keenness when it comes to action. Everything in cities cannot go well either on private or on the public level unless both of these groups are there to give their help. Quite. Then let us say that this marks the completion of the fabric which is the product of the art of statesmanship, the weaving together, with regular intertwining, of the dispositions of brave and moderate people. When the expertise belonging to the king brings their life together in agreement and friendship, and makes it common between them, completing the most magnificent and best of all fabrics, and covering with it all the other inhabitants of cities, both slave and free, and holds them together with this twining, and rules and directs without, so far as it belongs to a city to be happy, falling short of that in any respect. The older Socrates responds, "Another most excellent portrait, visitor, this one that you have completed for us, of the man who possesses the art of kingship, the statesman." And so that's the conclusion of the dialogue. So we have some work to do to tie these loose ends together. Okay, so in the first instance, the visitor describes a particular expression of the courageous. He says, "Well then, is a courageous soul that grasps the sort of truth not tamed, and wouldn't it be especially willing, as a result, to share in what is just, whereas if it fails to get a share of it, doesn't it rather side away towards becoming like some kind of beast?" So this truth that he mentions, there is this idea, this conception, that expertise, knowing in general perhaps, involves both that of the thing of concern and also of the background, so to speak. At least an awareness of it, not necessarily a full participation of it. And I think that this reflection is crucial because of what the visitor is saying here. So what do I mean by this? Well, at the end of the last episode, there was an example that I used that has to do with sight. If we look so closely at something, eventually it's going to be the case where whatever we are focusing on is going to become so close to our field of vision that it consumes it. It's the only thing that we can see in front of us. If we had no prior knowledge of the surrounding and we started in that condition, it would be quite obvious that we would be limited in terms of our understanding. It is not until we see identities that are separate from it that we then begin to appreciate contextually not only its relevance but also its interrelatedness among other things. And so I think that this concept of the potential of self-dissimulation by a primarily unproductive selfish enterprise is the thing that the visitor is talking about here. So he says again, is a courageous soul that grasps this sort of truth not tamed? And wouldn't it be especially willing as a result to share in what is just? Whereas if it fails to get a share of it, doesn't it rather slide away towards becoming like some sort of beast? So the first part of this is a courageous soul that grasps this sort of truth not tamed. There's an aspect of the courageous in the definitional sense, at least with respect to the visitor, where we consider the courageous an active sort, the type of individual that is enterprising, that has a type of keenness, as he will say later. And it is by this participation, by this active spirit, so to speak, that some of their true and best qualities come about. But it's also some of the potential landscape or environment by which some of their worst qualities can come about. Being overly confident or overly sure of their discernment or of their disposition. Now, when the visitor mentions the soul, the courageous soul that grasps the sort of truth is untamed, there's an interesting, I think, imagery that comes through here, because there's a certain trade-off or sacrifice that potentially occurs. That is, in the courageous spirit, in the courageous soul, what we consider to be tame, or this sort of submissive quality, willingness to cooperate, not go outside of established boundaries. This does not exist, or this is not integrated in those that are courageous and see this truth. And I don't think it's, since they see the truth in this part of the what the visitor is saying, it's not the case that this is a negative thing, that they are not tamed, so to speak. There can be a way in which the aspect of being tamed and not tamed, the aspect in particular of not being tamed in this situation, would be a bad thing. And we've discussed earlier how that would be the case. One primary example is the dangers that the courageous soul can bring upon a society when they are either unwarlike or what exists outside of that identity that is the principality that this courageous soul is a part of. What they are exposed to potentially are pathogens or large dangers that perhaps would submit them to that yoke of oppression or otherwise completely dominate them. And this would be spurred on by the insults, the intrigues of a courageous spirit that has this untamed quality to it. But on the other hand, there's a way in which tameness itself can be a negative. And this is part of the potential downside for the moderate, that they could be too tame and too submissive, that they can be taken over, they can be taken advantage of, made slaves, etc. And this extends not just in terms of this sort of cutthroat competition between ancient societies. This is much more. I think we can weave this into our own daily experiences. There are times where I feel that I am much more submissive than I ought to be. And there are other times where I feel that I'm much more biting, as the visitor calls it, as I ought to be. And this sort of this sharp intrusion, or the submissive escape, can both lead to some unfortunate downsides. But again, the thing that unites both of these are the good, and the good qualities that emerge from them is what makes it possible for them to be integrated. Now, there's one more subtle point that I think is worth going over here. Is a courageous soul that grasps this sort of truth not tamed, and wouldn't it be especially willing to share in what is just? So there's a relationship here between the courageous spirit being untamed and the willingness to share in what is just. Now, I think the willingness to share in what is just is if they have their share of truth, full stop. But also, there's this idea that the lack of tameness is a natural expression of the spirit of the courageous, given goodness and truth. Or maybe more specifically, we would say that within what we perceive to be the good and the true, the expression of the untamed, courageous spirit has these positive qualities. I suppose the contrary could be true as well, in the sense that the untamed, courageous spirit, when it does not share in that truth or good, would find itself on the contrary side of that untamed expression. But I suppose, if it is to be of the good and of that which is true, it would be disposed towards not being tamed and towards what is just. Whereas, if it was not disposed to the truth, it would be an untamed spirit that tends towards the beast. And the beast in this sort would be something of the characterization of a non-rational, base desire, executive leader, let's say, that the base desires are the executive leader of the cognitive light cone. This would be the beastly expression. So now we move to the moderate. And he says, what of the case of the moderate sort of nature? If it gets its share of these opinions, doesn't it become genuinely moderate and wise? So pausing here for a moment, I'm not sure how I feel about becoming genuinely moderate as a way to describe the moderate sort of nature. It doesn't help us all that much. It's not very descriptive. But moderate and moderation, it goes well with wisdom. Because wisdom is a type of seeing. It's a type of seeing points of information in a broad network, and being able to act on that information based on their relations. And moderation, I think, is a recognition of that expression. Because if we are to be moderate in our affairs, we are not to push too strongly in one direction, so to speak. And what I mean by that is, if we take food, for example, we don't gorge ourselves. We don't go to the store when we are stressed and buy a bunch of chocolate or whatever the situation is, and eat so much that we fall asleep. The moderate person, if they are stressed, establishes goals, tries to understand the problem, all of the different aspects of that problem, and then implement solutions to reduce the stress. And if there is some sort of gratifying experience that might be had from a piece of chocolate, then it is placed in a proper context, such that the experience is appreciated more so than the desire of mind to be absent through such an experience, to the extreme of the experience. So again, and what of the case of the moderate sort of nature? If it gets a share of these opinions, doesn't it become genuinely moderate and wise? So far as wisdom goes in the context of life in a city. So that's kind of interesting. And why would you bring that into it? Perhaps to give the image a bit of flavor in the context of life in a city, but there are many contexts. Life in a city is just one small piece of that. But I suppose this is the point. Wisdom, as it can be seen, may grow based on the environment that we're in. So a wise mind may appear to have different flavors depending on the environment that it is brought up in. In a rural or agricultural setting, as opposed to a city, this type of wisdom surely appears differently. I think it can be appreciated differently. And as someone who lives in a city and participates in a city and deals with a community, perhaps a bit disjointed as it is in the modern era, but nonetheless, I can appreciate the types of information that we are exposed to. All of the various types of expertise that people are engaged in. The markets that are formed. The interplay between goods and services, what people offer, what people purchase. And the visitor says, well, if it fails to get a portion of the things we were talking about, doesn't it very appropriately acquire a disgraceful reputation for simple-mindedness? So the moderate now, just as we've talked about the courageous and how they can fall into this disposition of baseness, a similar disposition of baseness can result from those who are, I don't want to say more passive, but more conservative in their actionable behaviors. Whereas the courageous sort are always on the move, always actionable. The moderate, on the negative end, would be considered lazy or passive or simple-minded. And on the productive end, are extremely engaged, but are conservative again in their actions because they are wise. They know that not every action is necessary. Perhaps not every whim or pursuit is worth putting forward, and that their desire for stability and order has great value to it. It provides a structural element to society. So, lacking in terms of truth, if a person of moderation is to lack this goodness of understanding, then it seems quite clear that they would have no idea, they may have the desire, but no idea of exactly how to moderate their behaviors. So this is like a classic adolescent religious experience, I think, in which one is within the thralls of religious devotion, but has very limited practical understanding or wrestling with the text, and then implementing it practically with people in interpersonal relations. And it leads to very lofty opinions, but with very little rational backing, I would say. Another potential avenue, I think, is that passivity. The passivity of moderation, that conservative, the desire to restrain, but restrain for no purpose. So it becomes this sort of just general lack of action, a quite simple minded expression. It's the restraint of the mind for the sake of its own restraint, which of course is a poor and unproductive, or as the visitor says, disgraceful type of experience. Now he continues in a curious manner, and he says, "And let's not say, shall we, that this sort of interweaving and bonding, in the case of vicious men in relation to each other, and good men in relation to vicious men, ever turns out to be lasting." So the term vicious is an interesting introduction. The first thing that I think about now is he's describing those who are aware of only the negative, only of the contrary, or perhaps those also that are aware of both but prefer the contrary, prefer the wickedness and the evil. That of this sort, there is an ever-polluting stream. While it may be water and essential for life, it cannot be a productive participant in that purpose because it is polluted. And by this, even that which is good, when it comes to drink from it, it will be polluted by it. So it never turns out to be lasting. There's always some sort of disruption. He says, nor that any sort of expert knowledge would ever seriously use it in relation to people like this. Now I want to reread an important part by the visitor. Earlier he said, "I call divine, when it comes to being souls, that opinion about what is fine, just, and good, and the opposites of these, which is really true and is guaranteed. It belongs to the class of the more than human." So the key takeaway from this, initially when I read it, was, "and the opposites of these." I had a difficult time understanding what this is, and perhaps I still do, but I think I understand it better than I did at first glance or first read. And I take it to mean that, as I've described already on this episode, is that there's an importance of perspective, and that context matters, and that if we have poor perspective, that we will not be able to understand fully the context of a thought, of some participation, of the fittedness of something, the purpose of something even. And when I see the opposite, when he says the opposite of what is just and good, what is fine, just, and good, we're not thinking about good things, of course. It's the opposite of that. The vicious, it would seem, have their eyes closely focused on that absence of goodness and justice, which of course always trends towards absence of being. And there's something about expert knowledge that perhaps by the visitor's definition is inherently, although it may not be perfect in the sense that when one person is the expert at something, let's say weaving, for example, we could take all of the other types of expertise out there, and we could say with the degree of certainty that the expert in weaving is at least a novice and unaware of the majority of things that one can be an expert in. There's just too much information out there. Now, the key thing here is that it doesn't really matter what the weaver does not know. What matters is that he has some expertise. And this expertise is I don't know what we would classify it as. It serves, I think, multiple functions. His expertise is a tool, surely. It's a tool through which his ontology is expressed. What do I mean by that? His orientation of being, or his relatedness of being, to everything else, just information in general outside of him. This work, this expertise, again, a tool. And it's more than just a simple task or a piece of a broader puzzle of information. It is that, but it's something more because it's embodied in this experience, and there are these qualities that are associated to conscious experience, such as memory and self-awareness, self-identity, the awareness of that identity. And with any form of expertise in which one, I think the visitor doesn't describe it in exactly these terms, but I think any expert, if he is to be an expert, has some generative capacity, that he is able to see the goodness in his or through his expertise. And by seeing the goodness, the thread of goodness that connects his mind to the world, he is able to draw certain conclusions, but certain lessons from this experience. He doesn't have to be an expert in all fields to be able to see things clearly. He needs the principles that he knows from his expertise, and he needs to be able to understand how to play with these principles and build them upon one another, so that when new problems arise, it's not necessarily that he knows the solution to every problem, but he knows a way to think about problems such that the solution becomes a possibility. Now, resting on the visitor's claim, he says one of the ways to do this well, there's a few things, I think, but the one that sticks out to me the most, as I read a moment ago, is that the visual landscape of understanding the difference between what the just is and what the good is from that which is not. Because when we accurately make those distinctions, we clearly separate what often appears to be intermixed. But if it is to remain good, just, and beautiful, then it cannot be intermixed. And he alludes to this, or says it directly perhaps, when he talks about the vicious. In the case of vicious men in relation to each other, and good men in relation to the vicious, it never turns out to be lasting. He says that it only takes root through laws and in dispositions that were both born noble in the first place and have been nurtured in accordance with their nature. This is expert knowledge he's talking about. So, how do we... Maybe I should back up for a second. Before getting into the imagery behind, or the definition perhaps behind what the law is, I think it's important to reflect on the image of the root and expert knowledge as the thing that comes to, in a way a plant does, grow roots into the soil such that it can receive nutrients and grow the top portion, the sort of observed portion, the portion that relates to a different, almost seemingly a different side of life. And as if these parts were flipped over, the leaf was buried in the earth and the roots were exposed to the air, the organism would not survive. So, why do I say this? I say this because I think there must be a subtlety when we approach these things. It's always easy to try and find something that is a principle that will last forever. But in changing circumstances, we have to understand changing understanding. Truth may stay constant, but the way it is seen and the way it is expressed is different. And given that we are imperfect beings and we see mixtures all of the time, it's hard to see and to separate the good from everything else. I think this is sort of part of the visitor's point, though. Now, one of the most successful tools, maybe we could say frustrating tools. There are plenty of things that could be said about it, but the laws, they have been with us for such a long time, in more ways than one, in different forms than one. But as it has been said before, the laws are a sort of memory. They're a certain prior event that has caused us to, through experience, have made a decision about what we ought to do. And of course, if the law is a good one, then it will stand the test of time. Changing institutions may alter the way in which we relate to the law. And perhaps the letter might have to be changed, but the spirit remains the same. Because there's a certain expression of being in the way that we desire things, or the way that we wish things to be, how they ought to be. And we have to remember that the law is part of this root that he mentions. And this root is being born of the seed, or maybe I should say I'm not sure what the seed is yet. But the purpose of this organism is expert knowledge. Well, no, I shouldn't say that. I should say that the seed is expert knowledge. And that if we consider that this seed only takes root through something, then the law rather is part of the soil through which the seed grows. And if we think about it in this way, then we can think about, in the natural sense, there are plenty of ways in which a plant may or may not grow in a particular soil, and for different reasons. And so I think laws probably have such a variability that it's possible to have a society full of laws, but they do not facilitate expert knowledge. It probably wouldn't be a society that would last long, but I suppose it's possible in the rising and falling of the tides of societies. So we've established that there are these good laws and bad laws. Laws in general serve a purpose. Now, we should not think necessarily about the ineffectiveness of our tools. We should think about the purpose of our tools and what we design them for. If they are insufficient to solving our problems, then we should design better tools. And so this experience occurs throughout our collective experiences. And there are many factors that go into this. No one, I think, controls the laws. The laws are... people have influence over them, of course, but the laws are a very large hyper object, so to speak, a hyper agent. There's purposeful direction to it. There's grounding to it. There's a sense of dynamism to it. Again, in certain ages restricted, some ages open. But it is our collective memory of sorts. Perhaps even in the simplest of laws, there are implications. Implications that go down to the ontological rooted layer. He says, what I propose we should say is that it only takes root through laws, and those dispositions that were both born noble in the first place and have been nurtured in accordance with their nature. Now, these dispositions, we have the word again, disposition. Of this, I think about principles. And I return again to orientation, or ontology. From the Google definition, we have a person's inherent qualities of mind and character, the way in which something is placed or arranged, especially in relation to other things. So I think you combine these two. We have a fairly good definition of where this word disposition rests. Now, qualities. I find this to be an interesting word as well, something that I often overlook. So if I define quality, it is the standard of something as measured against other things of a similar kind, the degree of excellence of something. So it's quite a philosophical definition. But it seems, and it sounds familiar, the standard of something as measured against other things of a similar kind. We've been talking about perception and relevance and context here. Now, for qualities to be some standard, or something that is a measure, then we have, I suppose, tools to use. We have a bunch of tools to use. If we can perceive many different qualities, we have at our disposal many different tools. And if we have all of these tools at our disposal, we can build dispositions. We can identify dispositions. And perhaps, as I think about these dispositions and the development of a person's qualities, I think not just in terms of our own objective utilization of these things, but also our subjective internal usage of a quality of ourselves. If we are to have these little standards within us, surely we ought to orient them well. Of course, it's always the question, well, what is well, what is good, and all this sort of thing. Well, we've talked about laws, we've talked about this, again, what seems to be a nested procedure within a procedure almost, or rather a method within a method, that one's internal disposition is a bit methodological. There's a dynamism there, where things and pieces come to be, changes occur. The same thing happens with laws, but laws are sort of above it somehow. There's this interrelated participation, but laws are a different level. It's not just the self that we're considering. But as we see here, we're also considering the self. So expert knowledge it takes root through laws in those dispositions that were both born noble in the first place. So this is a tough one for me to chew on here. So again, the laws are the substrate. The seed is this expert knowledge. But there are two things that the seed is in. One is the environment, that productive soil, but also within dispositions. It's hard to imagine two different soils, but why imagine such a thing? The soil is not a monoculture, after all. There are plenty of different things that are within soil that allow plants to take root. If soil was one thing, I think we would have a different way of conceptualizing this. But we can say that it is one thing in a sense of its identity as the soil, but the soil itself is a mixture. And by this mixture, there are different qualities, there are different standards by which we can identify and measure. Now, again, he says, what I propose we should say is that it only takes root through laws in those dispositions So one of the things that is within this soil is dispositions. There are inherent standards of measure. And these inherent standards of measure grow or facilitate the growth of expert knowledge, which, as we've described, is a certain equivalency to understanding that which is good. And given that this is so difficult to find, it's good to have a roadmap to get there. So we have to have some sort of expert knowledge to do it. Now, when he continues and he says, in those dispositions that were both born noble in the first place and have been nurtured in accordance with their nature, I have to think here again about this concept of good and bad law, but moreover to that, extending this out into the conceptions of terms in general. There are good and bads of many things. We discussed a moment ago that the statesman has to be appropriately attuned to moderate principles, but also courageous principles. And there are negatives to both. I think in this way we can say that there are negatives of what is considered noble. And what I mean by that is, if we are to consider something as noble that somehow dilutes the goodness of the thing, like, in my opinion, hereditary or bloodline nobility, as opposed to a nobility that has a view of the individual as a great potential of experience. And this potential of experience can be facilitated, it can be destroyed, it could be, there are many things that can be done with it, I suppose. Now, of course, the potential is not necessarily the thing that makes it noble. The nobility comes out of the potential. And it's no secret that there are plenty of people that are within a class of noble qualities and those that are not. And it comes to be apparent when it involves problems for the nobility. And what I mean by this, the problems of the nobility, is that among these standards, these weights, of which qualities of ourselves are one, the dispositions within us, there is a function by which we can maximize, we can reduce, we can entertain and not execute ideas that are consistent with the propagation and the production of being. If being as a harmony exists, honest with itself, changing, some parts decaying, some parts reintegrating that decay, some parts being born. Okay, so today happens to be a new day. And I kind of know where I left off yesterday, but it always takes some time to get back into it, so let's see where we end up. So I want to reread where we have been, so I could re-energize that spirit. The visitor says, "What I propose we should say is that it only takes root through laws in those dispositions that were both born noble in the first place and have been nurtured in accordance with their nature." Okay, so part of me thinks that last time I left off with speaking about noble. Maybe this is a point that has been passed, I'm not sure, but this is where I'm going to begin nonetheless. As I mentioned last time, there is this idea, a popular idea, an idea in my mind, that that which is noble, or the people that are in the class of the nobility, are there because of some birthright, or some historical, this is a historical term, and it may not have any bearing on our present state or whatever the situation might be. I don't think that this is the case. I think to call a noble person or a class of people noble, the fact that there has been hereditary elements to it and strict bloodlines is a secondary consequence. I think it would be missing the primary point if we stayed there. Now, I think the primary point is more so that the nobility, or somebody that is noble, possesses certain characteristics. They have particular dispositions. The visitor says, in those dispositions that were both born noble in the first place and have been nurtured in accordance with their nature. So there is some thinking here that I have to wonder about. I do think that considering an environment and going off that analogy with the soil and how certain soils are not going to be productive for the growing of certain plants. We extend this analogy to societies, we extend this analogy to education and to individuals. And surely, I think it would make sense to have an environment that was conducive to a particular type of person. And we know, just by the way of things, that it would not be possible for the whole of society to be noble. Now, we wish it to be, but just like on the earth, we can't plant a tree wherever we want. There are different types of environments, again, that are conducive to certain things. And I think we can move towards some ideal, surely, and have people express their more beautiful and good characteristics. But the bare fact of it is that the nobility can be a rare experience. So when the visitor says born noble, I think about an environment that a person is born into. So it's a particular substrate. The family has particular values. Maybe they have a certain amount of wealth that affords a certain amount of something. They are not destined to spend all of their time, all their productive energies on mundane things. There's an affordance that brings them up outside of that. Them being the noble class or the noble environment. And then there's the aspect of nature, in accordance with their nature. And this is something that I think is innate to all of us. We all have particular natures. We all have particular inclinations. Materially, I'm sure there are reasons for this. It doesn't really matter all that much, I don't think. Interesting to learn about, but I think it's sufficient to say that there are foundational things about people that we would call their nature. And of course, there are variable things about people. We have this sort of freedom of will within the constraints that we are afforded. But this nature, I think, is the other side, where if the environment is not there, the nature is still there. So the possibility is still there. But given how societies are and how they have been, as I mentioned just a moment ago, with this experience of limitation based on necessity, it's quite clear that nature, the expression of the goodness within one's nature, at least, might be quite limited because of obvious concerns, especially when we consider the ancient world, when death and predation, war, all of this sort of thing was much more present. At least it seems to me, that survival in life itself was much more fragile. Not that it wasn't beautiful, of course, but fragile. And that, I think, that caused a particular mode where people have to be diligent in the things that they do. Of course, we still have to do that now, but materially, I think we're better off, and it affords us certain things. And one of those things, I think, has to do with our ability to explore our natures a little bit more than our forefathers perhaps were able to. So here we have three things. Earlier I mentioned the substrate, that both the weaving and expert knowledge takes root. We have the laws, we have the noble situation, which has a bit of a question mark for me on it, or maybe an extended view than my prior conception, and then that of nature. So again, the laws, a form of memory of man, a form of experience of man, something that is passed down, a gift. We have the noble, which is by some extension a type of soil, we can say, but it's not enough to just say that it is a soil. It's a type of environment which includes stability, it includes education, it includes, I think, a mother and a father, love. All of these contribute to that productive environment. And then there is the nature, the way in which a person is constituted, which has various material consequences, or material causes, I should say, genetics and all the rest of it. The visitor continues and he says, and that it is for these that this remedy exists, by virtue of expertise. Now this remedy that he speaks about, there are a few different things that we would have to remedy. One is the potential situation for the virtues, the negative side of the virtues, as they relate to the broader whole. These have to be reconciled with, or rather I should say that they have to be given up in preference for the good aspects of a particular side of virtue. So of moderation and of courage, we reject those forms of relating to those things that are unproductive and that the statesman would not be able to articulate or to move forward as some sort of feasible mode of interweaving, because the unlikeness in that case would lead to its untangling and instability of the fabric, of the woven fabric. And then there's the other, in which the visitor mentions this situation about vicious men. And we didn't really go into defining that, but it's an interesting concept, I suppose. Vicious, animalistic, beast-like, that has come up earlier, but it's roughly, I think, all the same. It's a type of baseness and a desire to feed the lower appetites, and in the pursuit of that, what sacrifices many things that we would define as virtuous. Now, by virtue of expertise, we find ourselves in this place of resolving the opposition, the contrary to that which is good, of each identity that we can perceive. The visitor continues and he says, as we said, this bonding together is more divine, uniting parts of virtue that are by nature unlike each other and tend in opposite directions. It's more divine because it's less mixed, as in the human experience. In the human experience, certainly in my experience, I lack so much understanding, and it can be quite frustrating at times, let alone understanding, just basic attention, paying attention to the task, getting things done on time. Thankfully, I don't struggle as much as some people that I've known, but still, it's an issue. And with technology And all of the information that we are bombarded by, it takes an incredible amount of discipline to filter the information and to maintain a degree of attention that's useful and balanced, harmonious. And plenty of words that we can use here. He says, as we said, this bonding together is more divine, uniting parts of virtue that are by nature unlike each other and tend in opposite directions. So again, the divinity is the thing that rises above that place of mixture and uncertainty. The visitor says, yes, and the remaining bonds, which are human, once this divine one exists, are perhaps not difficult at all either to understand or to effect once one has understood them. Again, the divine bond gives us an idea of how to orient ourselves, the various likenesses and unlikenesses that exist within us, the contradictions of our opinions and of our inclinations. The divine bond helps us to harmonize all of these things within us. And so understanding ourselves, but also other people, becomes more simple, I suppose, easier. So young Socrates says, how then, and what are they? The visitor responds, those that consist in intermarriages and the sharing of children, and in those matters relating to private giving away in marriage. For most people, in the way they handle these things, do not bind themselves together correctly with respect to the procreation of children. So a couple of things that come to mind here. Before we reach this topic about marriage and children, there's sort of an open question. When we think about human bonds, there are plenty of human bonds. They are not just localized or restricted to marriage and of procreation. However, the fact that the visitor jumps here so directly, I think, is an indication of its value, or of the way in which Plato values this type of relationship, this type of bond. So intermarriages and the sharing of children, a curious way to express that. And in those matters relating to private giving away in marriage. So there's a cultural element here, giving away in marriage. There are plenty of ways in which cultures throughout history have gone about doing this. Giving away, what I think of immediately is the one that is given away is the woman, given away to the man. And that there is this familial responsibility behind marriage. And given that we are reading a Greek source in which their society was very centered around the man's direction, it's no surprise that this language is used here. And I don't say this to say anything negative about the approach. I think there are plenty of good things that can come about through arranged marriages and strong family relations. And just as the general theme of this, there can be negative things as well. I think one of the things that we lack in the modern era, while we may gain sort of an independence of choice and of will on the part of the woman, we lack this sort of protective experience and the attention, the focus on the importance of the family being involved in the giving away of the woman, because she is the one that will eventually bear the children. And it's this whole expectation that she is going to have children, that they're going to be brought up in a particular environment, that we have much of that cultural custom now, of course, but it has taken a blow in recent years. I think it would be difficult to deny that. So now, of course, it's the visitor's opinion that the people that are involved in these types of relationships and marriages do not bind themselves together correctly with respect to the procreation of children. And the next thing he says, I found curious the first time I read it. I think I understand it a little bit more now after reading it again, but he says, "Is there any reason why anyone should seriously concern themselves with censoring the pursuit of wealth and forms of influence in such contexts as if it were worth discussing?" And I think he says this because wealth is irrelevant to the building of virtue. Now, a moment ago we talked about the nobility and how one small sliver, an aspect of that, has to do with wealth as a part of an environment setting piece, more of a sociological observation than anything. But what we see here, virtue and proper integration, all of this does not depend on wealth. Proper binding, I should say, proper integration, similar kind of thing. He says it would be more appropriate for us to discuss those people who pay attention to family types and ask whether they are acting erroneously in some way. They act out of entirely the wrong sort of consideration. They go for what is immediately easiest, welcoming those who are much like them, and not liking those who are unlike them, assigning the largest part of their decisions to their feelings of antipathy. Now, this is surely a difficult thing, but we have to remember that divine bond. And that divine bond is the thing that excludes the negative aspects or qualities or characteristics of a person's experience and integrates the good. Now, there's no question, especially in the modern day, with our political divisions and abundant psychological operations that are imposed on us, I think that getting outside of separation as something that is concrete and insurmountable is quite difficult. And as for myself, as I'm actively looking for a partner, it can be difficult to move outside of what one desires and the likeness that may be maintained through maybe shared goals and this sort of thing. Shared goals, maybe it's a different, slightly different expression, but the desire to have somebody completely like myself is, it would be a limiting situation, I suppose. It would not be balanced. It would not afford the potential for that type of harmony that exists within the Statesman's expertise. Because the weaving that we would do would just be one thread. It would not create that stable structure, the balance of the virtues. Now, with regard to the insights that we get from the visitor's explanation of why the like should not marry like, he says, "It is in the nature of courage that when it is reproduced over many generations without being mixed with a moderate nature, it comes to a peak of power at first, but in the end it bursts out completely in fits of madness." So let's think about the first part of that. Again, it is in the nature of courage that when it is reproduced over many generations without being mixed with a moderate nature. So this idea of mixing has come up multiple times, many times in fact. And when the mind focuses on this broad substrate in which we can observe things, we can play around with things that are mixed, that are unmixed, the mind is open to all sorts of these thought experiments. But of the unmixed, we have an idea of purity, and I think that there are forms of, or a way of understanding knowledge in a similar way, in which knowledge is the purity of something leads us to a fuller understanding of that thing. The absence of impurities or falsehoods is something that we try. It is by the orientation of our attention and the tempering of our base desires that we are able to accomplish good things and attend to that which is true. And in this context, the mixing of the good and the bad dilutes the good and props up the bad or the false information. But this is not the only context in which we are thinking about mixing things. There are also ways in which it would seem, by the visitor's suggestion, that if we mix something that is pure at the outset, or if we don't mix something that is pure at the outset, it may actually be damaging to that thing. Much like we can imagine the consumption of some acidic food or basic food over an extended period and then having some ailment that occurs because of that, or being exposed to pure carbon dioxide, for example. It's something that we cannot live off of, but yet it's still something, it's still a gas that's breathable. There are all sorts of mixtures for which their intended purpose necessitates that quality of being mixed, because it participates best when it is mixed but also harmonized in its mixture. Because we have to remember, it's not just any old mixture of courage and moderation. It's the mixture of good courage and good moderation that we are concerned with. Now, going back to the warp and woof imagery, I want to list again the characteristics that are specific to both of them. So of the moderate, we have ample, soft, loose, easily bent, and flexible. I think anything in its extreme, we can see why it would be a malady. It would make it difficult. So, for example, the ampleness of the moderate. In the extreme, the ample, the aspects of the cloth, if they are to be too ample, if there's to be too many of the woof, we would see an amplification of softness, of looseness, and flexibility. And in times when we need something that is durable and stable, this structure that gives too easily would be subject to tearing. It would be subject to not fulfilling those purposes that are necessary of a fabric. Now, on the other hand, when we think about the thread characteristics of the warp or of the courageous ones, we have the qualities of being firm, straight, tightly stretched, stiff, and resistant to bending. Now, if we had a structure that was completely stiff and rigid, we would not have a cloth. We would have some structure that is completely resistant to any sort of dynamism and growth or self-correction. Now, of course, this strength is good for defense of the city It is good for any number of things: resolution, leadership. I see a strong, firm pillar at the core of these individuals. And when the well-directed of the moderate, we think moderation, we think self-control, lawfulness, consistent, capacity for long-term civil order. Again, these people are ample in society. They form up much of the fabric. And so they are, by their numbers, they are important, I would say. So let's go back to what we were speaking of a moment ago. It is in the nature of courage that when it is reproduced over many generations without being mixed with a moderate nature. So the qualities and characteristics, as the purity begins to unfold over the lack of mixing with moderation, we get the extension of the negative qualities, perhaps. We get an extension of the general qualities of the warp. So that firmness is what we get. So in inflexibility, we can have a rashness, maybe perhaps a certain irrationality that comes from being too headstrong. The visitor mentions earlier about that risk for the overly courageous to begin wars with their neighbors that they know that they can't win, or to provoke unnecessary conflicts. The visitor says it comes to peak of power at first. We have to imagine that these people are good leaders. They are the rule setters, let's say. And the moderate sorts are those that follow the rules but are flexible to change. Now, these fits of madness, I think, comes from the lack of flexibility, the lack of dynamism that is necessary among any identity that relates to anything at all, which is all identities. Now, there's nothing wrong with constancy. The moderate understand this. They understand it because they have this love of law, and they are moderate in their expression. And so while a type of firmness, I think, leads to a type of order, the rigidity leads to a type of ischemia that reduces the necessary intake of information from outside. And when that pressure, that stronghold pressure is placed, what we see is a death in any number of ways. You can think of it economic, social, political, otherwise. And it surely would be a mad thing if one is so set in their ways that they cannot see obvious dilemmas that are in front of them. That requires a degree of flexibility to navigate through them. I think about the experience of the 20th century with strong state control and how this played out across Europe, across Asia, and where we are now in this bizarre, ever-changing landscape of powers. And with regard to the moderate, in its turn, the soul that is too full of reserve and has no admixture of courageous initiative, and is reproduced over many generations in this way, by nature grows more sluggish than is timely, and then in the end is completely crippled. Now, of this to say that I think that I'm a bit guilty. I have been in that position, too full of reserve without the courageous initiative, and that has led to stagnation at certain periods in my life. And as far as I can tell, if I can observe my own nature, I think it happens to be that I am disposed to this sort of moderate type. Flexible, but all the while needing this constant reinvigoration of initiative. And that has been a process as I've gotten older to learn how to light the fire and light it correctly, such that I can pay attention, and that reserve does not get into the way of productive pursuits. So the question that I have, although it may seem obvious at first glance, practically, how is it the case that the soul that is too full of reserve and has no admixture of courageous initiative, how is that this grows over time into sluggishness? We have to imagine at the outset, we start from this harmonious period in which there is a nice mixture between the courageous and the moderate, and perhaps they separate at some point. And this separation leads them to obviously to move in their own directions. And as far as the moderate is concerned, those qualities that were at once beneficial may not be immediately affected by the first or the second generation, but it's a number of generations, like the visitor says, many generations. And so left without this pulling, this tendency to move the pendulum in the other direction, it seems to naturally drift off by the sort of gravity of the self and the sameness of likeness. It moves into this domain, slowly closing itself off, hermetizing itself, as it were, schematizing, to use that word again. Then the qualities that were good are slowly stripped away, it would seem. And that, while that reserve, which is a natural disposition to prevent against that species of action, the species of behavior, the species of orientation in one's environment, at least the orientation in which one can find themselves in a given environment, that this quality of reserve is necessary for protection, is necessary for deliberation. It is necessary for prudence, at least an aspect of these things. But if we strip away all of those things for which we understand to be good, what we reserve is action in general. And of course, general action, to reserve such a thing, this limits our active potential in life. And if we are not to be productive and creative agents, then our purpose as human beings is not fulfilled. And we become, like the visitor says here, sluggish. And I'd expand this to say lethargic and committing one of those deadly sins. So the next thing the visitor goes over is a restatement about the importance of that what is fine and good ought to be the orienting principle in the marriage of these two things, of the interweaving together. He says, never to allow moderate dispositions to stand away from the courageous. Rather, by working them closely together, as if with a shuttle, through sharing of opinions, through honors, dishonor, esteem, and the giving of pledges to one another, it draws together a smooth and fine-woven fabric out of them. Now, what I find interesting is the sharing of opinions through honors, dishonor, esteem, and the giving of pledges to one another. So there's this indication that there will be times when the various unlikenesses are pulled too far. I don't want to say into their own nature, but also I think that that's probably most appropriate. And when that happens, and these sort of negative ischemic qualities occur, the other is meant to pull them back towards that center, the harmonious center. And by the qualities that are mentioned here by the visitor of honors, dishonor, esteem, we have both the outward and also the inward focus. Esteem, focusing on the inward value set, the inward management of value, recognition of worth, and then honor and dishonor, which has to do with more of a public esteem, work in the eyes of others. And in both situations, the balancing act has to take place. I imagine a spouse and their partner. That in the home environment, there is this, if it is productive, is to have this sort of dynamic interplay. Perhaps not as sometimes better than others, surely, but this dynamic interplay exposes the raw fabric of that esteem, the internal qualities. And as that relationship grows and develops, the integratedness of their unification is also a measure of their integration of the moderate and the courageous principles, if it is to be within their natures to occupy two different sides. The visitor says, for the dispositions of moderate people, when in office, are markedly cautious, just, and conservative, but they lack bite, and a certain sharp and practical keenness. And the dispositions of the courageous, in their turn, are inferior to the others in relation to justice and caution, but have an exceptional degree of keenness when it comes to action. Everything in cities cannot go well, either on private or on the public level, unless both of these groups are there to give their help. And this is where the king comes in, practicing the art of statesmanship to weave that fabric together. So this marks the end of the Platonic dialogue, The Statesman, here at part 16. So I'm thankful for the journey. Next time we will continue with the Platonic dialogues, the dialogue titled Parmenides.